what color hair she had because everything was red.
Suspicions pointed to a powerful family.
People treated them a little differently. They're part of the Kennedys.
Not for 2 decades would justice be done.
This is Martha's Day. This is truly Martha's Day.
In the history of American justice, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that money, power, and politics can wield undue influence over how a case is handled. In 1975, 15-year-old Martha Moxley was brutally murdered in the exclusive town of Greenwich, Connecticut. Her neighbors, the wealthy Skakel family, who also happened to be part of the Kennedy clan, came under suspicion. For decades, however, no one was brought to trial, leading to whispers that one of America's most powerful families might have taken matters into their own hands and gotten away with it. But in 2002, the Moxley family finally got what they wanted, the trial and the verdict. This is the story of that strangely twisting path to justice.
October 30th, 1975 was an unseasonably cold night in Greenwich, Connecticut. It was also Mischief Night, the night before Halloween. Eggs, soap, and shaving cream were the weapons of choice for the teenagers of this privileged community, one of the wealthiest in the country. In the elite enclave of Bellhaven, a gated neighborhood of about 40 homes on the coast of Long Island Sound, Dorothy Moxley spent the evening painting the trim around the windows of her second-floor master bedroom. Her husband, David, a managing partner at one of Manhattan's most prestigious consulting firms, was in Atlanta on a business trip. Their 2 children, 17-year-old John and 15-year-old Martha, had each been out with friends since just after dusk. It was a quiet night for Dorothy, until a noise shattered the stillness sometime between 9:30 and 10 o'clock.
I heard this commotion of voices. They weren't adults, they weren't little kids, they were probably teenage voices. And I don't know how many voices, and I don't remember what they were saying, but it was enough yelling or talking excitedly or doing something because it made me stop what I was doing and look out the window. And of course I couldn't see anything.
The commotion coincided with other noises in the neighborhood, sounds that seemed strange, even for Mischief Night.
Dogs barked furiously, whined, whimpered, and generally behaved in ways that they hadn't ever behaved before, according to their owners.
Having put down her brush to look out the window, Dorothy decided to stop painting and wait in the TV room for her children to return.
I didn't really get alarmed until, I guess, John came home. And then I started thinking, now where is she?
My mom told me that Martha wasn't home when I got home, and I was like, good. It's about time that I'm home on time when I said I'm going to be home, and, let her get in a little hot water.
A radiant girl with an exuberant personality, Martha had blossomed in the years since her family had moved from San Francisco to Connecticut.
She had a really cute, girlish figure, and she had a sense of style in her clothes, and she was very confident. She really had a great deal of confidence.
From the beginning, she was very friendly. She fit right in, always smiled, very nice, always kind. It wasn't the type of person that you could dislike.
At the end of 9th grade, after just 1 year in her new town, Martha was voted the girl with the best personality.
If someone had asked Martha the morning of October 30th if she was happy in Greenwich, she would have said yes, she loved living in Greenwich. Everyone was good to us. Everything was good.
But as Mischief Night slipped into Halloween morning, Martha Moxley still had not come home. Alarmed, her mother began frantically phoning neighbors. A friend of Martha's reported having seen her last at the home of one of Greenwich's richest and most famous families, the Skakels. The widower Rushton Skakel and his 7 children were well known because of their relatives. Back in 1950, Rushton's sister Ethel had married a 25-year-old law student named Bobby Kennedy.
I remember being around them as kids, and people treated them a little differently. You'd hear kids whisper, they're part of the Kennedys.
Martha Moxley had been with 2 of the Skakel boys, 15-year-old Michael and 17-year-old Tommy, earlier that evening. But when her mother called the Skakel house in the early hours of October 31st, she was told that Martha was no longer there.
My mom woke me up 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, said Martha wasn't home. She was very frightened. You know, it was very much out of the ordinary for her. She said she called all over the place. So she asked me to go out and drive around, see if I could find her. And so I drove around Belhaven and really didn't come across anything.
Soon after he returned home, his mother called the police.
At 3:48 a.m. on October 31st, 1975, was the first call made to the Greenwich Police Station.
An officer arrived at the Moxley home a few minutes later. He searched the house and the potting shed in the backyard and quickly scanned the rest of the lawn with a flashlight. But he found nothing out of the ordinary. Though panicked, Dorothy remained certain that her daughter would soon come home. This was, after all, Greenwich, one of the safest towns in the country. Waiting on the window seat that looked out onto the front yard, she finally fell asleep. Belhaven was a small neighborhood where news traveled fast. By late that morning, everyone knew Martha was missing, and they were afraid. It was an unfamiliar feeling in a gated community with its own private security force. Several neighbors now joined Dorothy's desperate vigil. Others banded together to scour the neighborhood for some sign of the missing girl.
I got up, I got dressed, I got my sister Holly. We called a couple other friends and made a plan to team up and go out and look for her, hoping that maybe she just got together with some people, grabbed some sleeping bags, and were sleeping out in one of the yards.
Shortly after noon, another neighbor, Sheila McGuire, cut across the Moxleys' property to join the search for Martha. The house was on her right. The yard sloped down to her left. And directly in front of her, beneath the branches of a large pine tree, lay a crumpled and bloody body.
Sheila McGuire came to the door and said that she was hysterical, she was crying, and said that she had found Martha. She thought she'd found Martha. And I said, well, is she all right? And she said she didn't think so. And so that's when my friends decided I shouldn't go and look. And this one friend said she would go and look and make sure that it was Martha and that she was all right. And she came back in the house in just a few minutes and said, well, it was Martha, but that she was dead. I sat in a chair in the living room and I was afraid to move because I knew if I moved, I would fall apart.
Greenwich police officers arrived minutes later.
It was just a bloody mess. It was very much like if you had taken a pumpkin and just smashed it so that you really couldn't tell it was a pumpkin later. We didn't know what color hair she had because everything was red from her shoulders up.
In pieces at the scene lay an unusual weapon, a golf club, a 6-iron, much like this one. The killer had apparently assaulted the girl the night before, bludgeoning her with the club until it shattered, then using the broken end of the shaft to stab her through the neck.
She was beaten so badly that the pathologist who performed the autopsy was unable to designate one of her many head wounds to be the actual wound that caused her death.
John Moxley was at varsity football practice when he heard the horrible news.
I was changing my clothes. The coach came up and told me that something had happened at home. My parents wanted me home right away. When I got home, I couldn't even pull up the driveway. There was police cars everywhere, an ambulance, yellow tape. You know, it was, like a scene out of a police movie.
Instead of using a regular telephone, a Greenwich police officer had called in his report over an open car radio. As a result, within minutes of the discovery of Martha Moxley's body, serene Belhaven had become a media circus. It was the chaotic beginning of an investigation that would continue to haunt the Greenwich police and the town itself for many years to come. On November 4th, 1975, a grieving Greenwich, Connecticut turned out for Martha Moxley's funeral. The vivacious high school sophomore had been found beaten to death 5 days before, a savage murder that had shattered the sense of security shared by residents of the wealthy community. Among the hundreds of mourners who gathered at First Lutheran Church that day was the nephew of Bobby and Ethel Kennedy, 17-year-old Tommy Skakel. What few at the funeral knew was that the teenager had become a leading suspect in the murder of Martha Moxley. The Greenwich Police Department's first major murder investigation in almost 30 years began beneath a pine tree on the west side of the Moxley property. There, on the afternoon of October 31st, a neighbor had discovered the body of 15-year-old Martha, who had been missing since the night before. Steve Carroll, a 21-year veteran, was one of the first officers on the scene.
They'd seen a lot of dead bodies, seen people blow their brains out and drown and that kind of thing, but never homicide.
From the beginning, the department's inexperience left its investigation open to criticism. Within minutes after Martha's body was discovered, a crowd of neighbors, reporters, and other policemen had descended on the Moxleys' yard. Former LAPD detective Mark Furman, himself no stranger to controversial investigations, has written a book highly critical of how the Greenwich police handled this high-profile case.
The crime scene wasn't secure. A crime scene doesn't know if those are cops' shoes or citizen shoes. You know, 10 uniformed cops standing within 15 feet of the body is a contaminated, messed up, chaotic scene.
Lacking the resources to handle a violent crime, the department had to call in the Connecticut State Medical Examiner. He was unable to make it to Greenwich Hospital to perform the autopsy until the following day, and never viewed the murder scene itself. Because of the delay, the results could only narrow the time of death to a 7.5-hour period between 9:30 p.m. on October 30th and 5 the next morning. But to critics of the investigation, the department's biggest blunder was its inability, some would say its refusal, to accept that such a horrific crime could have been committed by one of Greenwich's own. By the afternoon of Martha Moxley's funeral, detectives had largely pieced together the events of the young girl's last night. The story began around 6:30, when Martha headed out with a group of friends, armed with eggs, soap, and shaving cream.
It was mischief night. Martha asked, could I go out with these kids? I thought, oh, sure, go ahead, that's fine. After Martha walked out the door that night, I never did see her again.
Around 9, Martha and her friends, Helen Nix and Jeff Byrne, ended up at the Skakels' Belhaven mansion. They were greeted at the door by 15-year-old Michael.
They stayed in the house very briefly and then left the house, went out and sat into a Lincoln automobile that was parked in the driveway for the purpose of listening to music. They remained in that automobile a short time and were then joined by another Skakel brother, Thomas, who was 17 years old at the time.
Martha had gotten to know the Skakel boys that summer. She had even mentioned Tommy in her diary, writing that he was interested in her. Now, as Martha sat between Tommy and Michael in the front seat, Tommy began flirting with her. According to Martha's friends, who were in the back seat at the time, she resisted his advances.
The information was that at some time while they were in the car, Thomas Skakel placed his hand upon either the thigh or the knee of Martha Moxley. Martha pushed his hand away, and sometime thereafter he replaced it and put it on the thigh or the knee a second time, and she again pushed his hand away.
Then, around 9:15, two of the other Skakel teenagers, John and Rushton Jr., along with their cousin Jim, came out of the house.
And they say that the kids have to get out of the car because they're going to take their cousin home.
Michael reportedly volunteered to go with them. When he invited Martha to come along, she said no and got out of the car. The four boys drove off.
Now that left Helen X and Jeff Byrne. According to both of them, they immediately left to go to their home, leaving then Tom Skakel and Martha Moxley in the driveway.
Martha's two friends would later tell police that as they walked away, they saw Tommy pushing Martha, who fell to the ground and out of sight.
In talking to Tommy several times after and referring to what Helen said, we asked him if Martha got hurt when he pushed her. And he kind of draws a blank and he said, no, I didn't push Martha. Martha didn't get hurt.
Instead, Tommy told police he had left Martha around 9:30 and gone inside to work on a report about Abraham Lincoln for school. But when detectives checked this story with his teacher, they discovered that there had been no such assignment. It was sometime between 9:30 and 10 that Martha's mother, Dorothy, was startled by a strange commotion outside her window. Others in the neighborhood heard a chorus of dogs suddenly start furiously barking. With autopsy results unable to pinpoint the time of the murder, police publicly indicated that these noises marked the moment when they believed Martha was assaulted. Evidence at the crime scene suggested that sexual activity, possibly a struggle, may have played a part in the attack.
Her jeans and her panties will pull down to just below her knees. And there was one smudge on the inside of her thigh, as if it were a handprint, that it would appear that maybe somebody tried to open her legs.
Tommy Skakel, it seemed, had both the opportunity and possible motive to have assaulted Martha Moxley that night. He also had access to the murder weapon. Leaving the Skakel home the day Martha's body was discovered, police noticed a golf club bearing the insignia of a former touring pro named Tony Penna. It was the same brand as the shattered 6-iron found at the murder scene. Forensic testing would determine that the two clubs came from the exact same set. After thoroughly canvassing the neighborhood, police concluded that the Skakels were the only residents who owned that particular brand.
They found a matching set to the murder weapon inside the Skakel house, and all the bells should have gone off right then.
Yet despite all the evidence that at the time seemed to point toward Tommy Skakel, detectives focused their investigation elsewhere, away from Greenwich's most famous family.
We believe that it was somebody from the outside that did it, not one of those nice people from Belhaven.
Though the murder weapon was a powerful piece of evidence, Greenwich police realized that merely tying it to the Skakels was not enough to make an arrest. The Skakel kids often practiced golf swings in their backyard, leaving the clubs out on the ground until the next time they played. On its own, then, the broken 6-iron was no smoking gun. The family would simply claim that any outsider could have picked it up off the lawn. As authorities turned their attention to other suspects, the Skakel family would do little to help police. Some would even charge that they used their power and influence to hamper the investigation.
On October 31st, 1975, the brutal murder of 15-year-old Martha Moxley shocked the safe, sheltered city of Greenwich, Connecticut.
My mother always says she never knew where the keys to the house were because they never locked it. People were locking their doors now, being more careful. You're looking over your shoulder. It's just not the way it had been.
Frightened residents assumed that the young girl must have been attacked by an outsider or an outcast. The Greenwich Police Department shared the same suspicions. Despite evidence that seemed to implicate 17-year-old Tommy Skakel, Ethel Kennedy's nephew and the last person known to have seen the victim alive, detectives initially concentrated their investigation on other, less prominent suspects. The first was a 26-year-old graduate student who lived next door to the Moxleys and whose window overlooked the tree under which the teenager's corpse was found.
He knew the Moxleys, he knew the Skakels, he'd been to cocktail parties. He had some kind of strange conversation with Martha and also with her mother Dorothy. So they all thought he was a little strange.
Detective Carroll and his colleagues interrogated the young man for several hours. They obtained a consent to search form, a kind of voluntary search warrant for his home.
They scoured his house. They really searched his house well. Went through waste baskets, went through laundry machines.
Finally, after being hounded by police for weeks, the suspect passed a polygraph test and was cleared. Though they had not found the killer, Greenwich detectives had shown a willingness to aggressively go after a homicide suspect, a willingness that seemed to disappear in the presence of the powerful Skakels, one of the town's most prominent families for 3 generations. In the days following Martha Moxley's murder, investigators searched relentlessly for a crucial missing piece of evidence, the broken handle of the golf club used to bludgeon the teenage girl. Belhaven residents allowed police to drain their pools, dredge their ponds, and examine nearly every basement and building in their elite community. Yet even though the Skakels owned the only set of clubs in the neighborhood that matched the brand used in the murder, detectives treated the family with unusual deference. At the time, says retired Fairfield County State's Attorney Donald Brown, Connecticut law prohibited sweeping evidentiary searches.
What a lot of people don't realize that back in those days you could not conduct a search for mere evidence. They had no authority to get a search warrant to go in and search for bloody clothing. They had no authority to go in and search for hair in the storm drain. The only thing that they could have gotten a warrant for was the balance of the club that was removed from the crime scene, and that was all they could have searched for.
But police never secured even such a limited search warrant for the Skakel home. Instead, they got the family's permission to search the house, and then allowed 18-year-old Julie Skakel to do the looking for them.
You don't have any relative of the Skakel family search the house for you. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
Along with the consent search, Rushton Skakel Sr. had voluntarily granted Greenwich police officers permission to examine his children's school and